This podcast, the Heidelcast.
It's a Heidel Minicast. And now, Scott Clark.
We are not polishing brass on a sinking ship. This is part 2.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
If you'd like to know more about theonomy, Reconstructionism, Christian nationalism, all that stuff, well, it's all on the resource page at heidelblog.net/resources. For example, the theonomy resource page is easy to find. It's heidelblog.net/theonomy. Try to make those things as obvious as we can. The Christian nationalism page is heidelblog.net/Christian-nationalism. But the easiest way to do it, if you don't want to type out the address, is just to go to heidelblog.net/resources. You know, you could bookmark that page and it would always be there. Just click on that and boom. We're always adding new resource pages. We just added one yesterday, and we'll be letting you know about, in fact, 2 we've done in the last couple of weeks, and we'll be letting you know about those. But we put them up on the resource page even before we let you know about them. And on the Theonomy resource page, we have sources, we have articles, we have quotations, we have podcasts. So if you want to know about these movements, that's what you have to do. Check out the resource page on the Heidelblog.
The Heidelcast.
We're talking about not polishing brass on a sinking ship. That's the way the theonomists describe a non-theonomic approach to Christ and culture, to cultural engagement, to political engagement. In other words, if you're not committing to taking over in this world before Christ returns, and if you're not committed to bringing about a golden age before Jesus returns, then they consider that you are, polishing brass on a sinking ship. That's just not true. So far in this little series on an alternative to theonomy, I sketched in broad strokes why and how many American evangelicals came to see cultural engagement as fruitless. According to scholars of American evangelicalism, the world flight that marked fundamentalism and evangelicalism began to shift after World War II. Carl Henry wrote a book calling evangelicals to re-engage the culture, and that symbolizes the shift. If you're curious, the title of that book is The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism, and it was published in 1947. And I just checked for you. There are copies of this book on Amazon, and of course, there are still libraries in America where you can find a copy of this book, and this fairly important book. 30 years later, after Jimmy Carter's inauguration, it seemed as if everyone was born again. There were even pop songs on the radio that were celebrating being born again. Although, if you listen to that song, it's not clear at all that what Billy Preston and Sarita Wright were singing about had much to do with what we normally think of as being born again. Through the 1980s, the Moral Majority and other like organizations announced plans to take back America, wherein the neo-evangelicals would take their place once again in places of influence in the culture. Jimmy Carter had proved to be a disappointment, but with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, it seemed as if the campaign was succeeding. During the next 12 years of the Reagan and then the George H.W. Bush administrations, it seemed as if the Republican Party might indeed be the evangelical church at prayer, as one wag said. In their success, however, were planted seeds of future discontent and reaction in the same post-World War II culture that saw the re-engagement of fundamentalism, that's Carl Henry's term, with the culture, also saw a growing influence of neo-Kuyperianism in the broader evangelical world. And in fact, one of the things that puzzled me for a long time was why was it that these evangelicals and Baptists who, weren't Dutch, weren't amillennial, weren't Reformed, what was it about Kuyper and probably less Kuyper and more the Neo-Kuyperians that attracted them? I think I finally figured that out. I'll come to that in a minute. We've talked about that before. So those evangelicals who lacked a grammar and lacked categories to account for cultural engagement found it in the appropriation of Kuyper. Again, probably not so much Kuyper himself, but I think more in the Neo-Kuyperians. They liked the use of the adjective Christian to modify lots of creational and cultural activities that fit of the way they already saw the world. In other words, I don't think they really moved or changed, but they, in the Neo-Kuyperians, found a way to articulate things they already believed. And we'll come back to that. By the 1980s, worldview was a buzzword among evangelicals. During the 1980s, evangelicals had also begun turning to theonomy and Christian reconstruction for inspiration and intellectual leadership. And those two sources of engagement, Neo-Kuyperianism, that is Kuyper's followers, and the Theorecons, tended to speak in triumphalist terms relative to the future and relative to the broader, largely non-Christian culture. Supported by their postmillennialism, the Theorecons looked forward to a future Christian dominion through the gradual leavening of the culture by Christian cultural and political influence. And by the way, as I've pointed out in other episodes of this series on theonomy, also the federal vision. They're going to baptize their way to cultural influence because remember, for a lot of the theonomists, the federal vision is their explanation for the way the Lord works. And in the federal vision, you get in by baptism, wherein you are given all the benefits of Christ provisionally, and provisionally meaning provided you do your part. You cooperate sufficiently with the grace that you've been given in your baptism. In other words, you get new life, and that's just the beginning. You get election, you get union with Christ and justification and adoption, and all the benefits of Christ are given to you in your baptism. So that's the other side of this program. So cultural engagement and the rebuilding of Christendom through baptismal regeneration, etc. So in their own way, in contrast to the culturally pessimistic dispensational versions of premillennialism, the Neo-Kuyperians looked optimistically at the future. They spoke of transforming the culture and redeeming the culture. The evangelicals were looking for a way to engage the culture and looking for reasons to engage the culture.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
Nevertheless, Washington and American culture more broadly proved to be harder to reform than some, perhaps many, evangelicals had anticipated. Just as evangelicals, including for the sake of this discussion, the Theorecons and the Neo-Kuyperians of various sorts, were positioned close to the levers of political and cultural influence, the culture squirted, as it were, through their collective fingers. Or we could think of a wet football on a cold and frosty November morning. During the Reagan administration, broadcasting was deregulated. Cable television exploded in popularity, and suddenly the sources of cultural influence were not 3 broadcast networks, but a growing number of cable outlets, not subject to the same sorts of regulation that had governed broadcast stations. Radio stations, which once aired a considerable amount of religious programming as part of their public affairs commitment, dumped it in favor of revenue-producing commercial programming. The market for media became increasingly fragmented. Then came public access to the internet in the early 1990s. The speed at which media sources proliferated, in which niche marketing became the norm, increased exponentially, so that today, just as the big 3 or 4 broadcast networks no longer set the agenda for television, no longer do 2 newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post, set the agenda for print, as it were. journalism. Because who reads print papers anymore? Everybody reads the paper online, and increasingly people aren't even reading newspapers online because the disenchantment created by the attitude and imbalance in coverage and analysis has driven away the market. And so the newspaper business is dying right before our eyes. Thus, the Christian right did not achieve much of what it had hoped to achieve. 20 years after the inauguration of Jimmy Carter, another Southern Democrat was in the White House, and he was seeking to reverse the Reagan Revolution. A series of scandals, his impeachment. It almost seems quaint now to remember all the Sturm und Drang, all the drama and worry about having an impeachment, the first impeachment since President Johnson in the 19th century. And we've had two since then. So they've just become a regular feature of American political life. It's not the way the world looked in the 1970s when Nixon was threatened with impeachment and he resigned in order to avoid it. And then when it happened to Clinton, it was a great shock and everyone assumed it would not happen again for another century or so. And as I say, we've already had two more. So now presidents expect to be impeached as soon as they lose the majority in the House and the Senate. At any rate, so a series of scandals and impeachment and opposition by a Republican House of Representatives slowed his momentum in his second term. The 9/11 attacks plunged the West into a long war with a hard-to-find, religiously motivated enemy that for some, perhaps unfairly, cast doubt on the very idea of social engagement fueled by a deeply held religious rejection of modernity. Those born after the first Reagan inaugural have grown up assuming the post-Reagan prosperity as a given, but they've also grown up with a president who did not have sex with that woman, even when it turned out that he had, and who had to deconstruct the verb is. It all depends on what is. And we really went through that. They've grown up under the specter of 9/11. In fact, we're now at a point where a lot of young people don't even have any memory at all of 9/11. They relate to 9/11 the way I relate to the Zapruder film. It's just a piece of video. I mean, it's real. It really happened, but it's one thing to live through it and watch it live, as it were, and it's another thing to see it just as a piece of history. The city shining on a hill had lost some of its luster. The decades of religious scandals and embarrassments, and again, a lot of young people have no memory of this, but the series of scandals involving Jimmy Swaggart, Jim and Tammy, Robert Tilton, Pat Robertson, Benny Hinn, ad nauseum, diminished the credibility of the evangelical project of Christian cultural renewal. How could Christians be renewing the culture when there seemed to be so much rot in their own lives and churches? The parents and grandparents of the millennials have been ambivalent about late modernity. Mom works because they like the new standard of living, but she feels guilty about it, and she's conflicted between family and work. Many of their friends are divorced, so heterosexual marriage hasn't fared very well during the period when evangelical, political, cultural influence was at its height. The children and grandchildren of the baby boomers seem largely to accept a high divorce rate among heterosexuals, and they accept homosexual marriage as inevitable and even a good thing. As a group, the millennials, and I think the Gen Zers or Zoomers, tend toward subjectivism. Even the true believers, the Theo-Recons, seem to have given up their original program of cultural transformation through direct political action. Instead, as I say, they've turned to a program of cultural transformation through sacerdotalism, that is, priestly religion via their theology of baptismal, election, union, justification, etc., ostentatiously self-named as the federal vision. Jerry Falwell spins in his grave. Despite the evangelical rhetoric of triumph, renewal, and transformation, the culture today seems largely dominated by low-information voters who are more like Snooki Then Groen van Prinsterer, who was the founder of the Anti-Revolutionary Party in the Netherlands, who lived from 1801 to 1876. That's enough for this episode. Stay tuned. We'll continue this tomorrow.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
For this podcast, the Heidelcast.